So welcome everybody. I'm Pekka Metsaranta, the founder of Sisua and CEO. I've got with me Mike Princi. Mike, you want to just briefly introduce yourself?
Yeah, I am Mike Princi. Thanks, Pekka, for having me. We put together this series over the last couple weeks to just share some of our thoughts. I work with two companies actually. ThoughtStorm Strategic Capital that is doing mostly the buy side work that we end up doing, and Outcome Partners where we do a lot of our integration.
The agenda for the call is really we're just going to quickly cover what we talked about in the three sessions and some of the key takeaways. This is a Q&A session, so we would encourage you to ask any questions that you had based on what we talked about previously, if you've had a chance to watch those videos, or any other questions that you may have. You can use the chat, or you can use obviously the normal ways that Zoom meetings work. But that's going to be the agenda. And without further ado, we'll just get into it. So, just starting off with what did we actually talk about? So, Mike and I had three conversations, which we broadcast over the last couple of months. So, the first conversation was why is your integration team lying to you and what to do about it? In that session, what we covered was why it's so important to have a clear strategy on what you're trying to do. What is the value that you're trying to achieve from your M&A programs? We talked a lot about how you actually start planning for a deal and for the post-integration phases and what you need to do there. And we talked about the importance of setting up your governance early on in a pragmatic way to be able to put in place the right way of controlling these things. And we brought in some systems thinking, not IT systems, but the broader concept of systems. And then last, talked a little bit about how do you spot risks. So how do you know that things should be being escalated where there's trouble and where there's challenges? Our second conversation, it's all broken. Now, how do you deal with it? Was all about managing risk systems and people when things get messy. And there we focused a lot on values and making sure that actually progress sessions are not just updates, but are really based on actions and tracking decisions and driving things that way to make sure that things get done and it's not just a talking shop. And then we talked about some of the tracking around those. So the importance of KPIs. How do you actually set up the right systems to help with the deal? How do you track progress? And sometimes how you just have to use feeling if something doesn't feel right to spot where there are issues and how to solve things. And then lastly, we outlined some thoughts on how you could actually manage risk and the concept that red, whilst in some organizations is unacceptable, is actually a great thing to see being reported and is a culture that we would absolutely encourage people to adopt to highlight things. And then our last conversation really focused on how do you step up and become a leader. So there we talked about three lenses that every leader should use: financial, human, intellectual capital. And then we explored some thoughts around how to tackle those and some of the integration challenges that come with some of the things. So those were the three conversations we had. Mike, any other things you want to highlight in terms of our chats?
No, I think you did a great overview, right? With the chip knees, blackened eyes, skin knees that we've had doing this, and I'm sure some of the people on the call have. I'm excited for a pretty engaged conversation.
So what we were hoping for is a two-way conversation, right? So please do ask any questions that you may have thought about as part of those conversations. As I said, you can use the chat. You can obviously speak up as you see fit to, and we'll try and answer as best we can based on our experience.
Well, let's take some of the topics apart. So we first mentioned in that first topic that our integration team was lying, right? What a terrible thing to say about people working really hard, trying to do great things. And what we concluded, if you saw that session, is they're not really lying to you. There's a systemic issue that is causing them to not report accurately. And it came down to three major C's: communications, culture, and capacity. Anybody have any thoughts or questions on any of those?
Mike, so capacity is a big one, right? And everybody has limited capacity. So how do you deal with that problem, especially from a leadership perspective when it's just a challenge all round?
It's an excellent question, right? Capacity being a a challenge is something we see in many, many deals. You've got two companies that you're slamming together, and oftentimes those people are not sitting around with a lot of extra time or spare capacity to do things. And now we've given them a bunch of extra tasks, that often come with different tools, different team members, and in many cases, very unclear guidance. So how do you actually solve the capacity issue, which I consider an underinvestment in the deal? Right? There's only so many available hours. How can you apply them effectively? And that's where you start thinking about the two components there. What do I do to enhance the team? A big part of what Pekka and I have done for much of our careers is we go in as either interim executives or we bring teams in to run parts of those integrations. Those teams bring, as I like to joke, a specially developed set of skills developed over a long career that we bring to the table to overcome some of those capacity challenges in terms of just available hours people have to organize and to do work. But the second part is thinking about the tooling and the tools. And in many ways, there are lots of ways that you can streamline by using tools to create the concept of capacity or through productivity improvements. So those are two ways that I like to attack it. But Kathy, I always see that as an underinvestment in the deal. We're willing to pay a lot of money for a company, but then we're not willing to invest to make the value aspirations come to fruition.
I
Great
would
insights. Thank you.
also, I'd love to add to that. I think for me, not investing in the capacity early means you take pain later. So at some point, that capacity is going to have to be put in place. So M&A deals are not side of desk activities, and therefore, actually, the subject matter experts and the people who need to input and do the work need to be made available. And therefore, there is a very clear investment case to either backfill those folks or find others that actually can help, and making sure that the whole organization can be brought behind these things and find those hidden SMEs as well inside teams to create additional capacity and additional people to go to. I think too often it's the same people that everyone goes to every single time for everything. And the solution to that is either backfill or bring externals in to support them to take parts of their job off the plate so they can focus on what matters. So I do think it's an upfront business case thing there as well.
I like that, Pekka. It's the pain of investment or the pain of regret. Love it.
Yeah, exactly right. Exactly right.
It does feel like there's a bit of a vicious cycle here because I think everybody believes exactly what you've said in terms of these deals need to be resourced properly and have the right skills up front. But let's face it, many of them don't. So if you're an expert being parachuted in or being given a deal for the first time in a company that doesn't believe in that level of investment, what's the magic trick to effectively getting to that desired end state, given that there's, let's say, no organizational belief in the value of that initial investment up front?
That's a great and complex question, Nick. Pekka, do you want to jump in on that one?
So,
I've
so,
got
so
thoughts.
my, so my,
I don't want to lead each time though.
no problem. So my thought is actually, what we specialize in is large scale transformations, large scale actually driving these programs, right? So it comes down to pace and control. And actually, I think the simple answer that I've seen in many organizations is the first time organizations try to do this, you get the control of the program, everybody runs at base and starts to burn out. And that burnout creates the investment case later to actually bringing resources. So they don't necessarily bring it in up front. But you do need to still control these things because they do still need to get done. And then that creates that belief that next time around, actually, you should do something different. I also think that maybe the magic is some of these stories is actually telling people, here's what we've tangibly seen happen if you don't do this, and helping to create some of that buy-in. But I agree with you. And more often than not, M&A programs, large transformations, large scale IT system programs, people don't bring in the investment up front, and it causes pain. And then you end up with bottlenecks. And that's when the bottlenecks and I guess the erosion of value and being able to demonstrate where those costs are then going to be realized creates an imperative to bring in additional resources. But it often comes too late. So I think part of the answer is also being able to articulate up front what will happen if you don't do this, and what is the true cost. Sometimes that's not believed until it actually happens. So that'll be my experience.
No, those are I think that value articulation and the risk articulation are so important in that, Pekka. A couple other things, Nick. This is something you and I have done many times, right? You get parachuted in. You've never worked with the team before, typically, and you're asked to do great things. You've got the hardest job in the world because you don't know anybody in that team. You don't own anybody in that team. So you've got to think about how do you create sources of influence. So, and that's a big part of the magic. One of the ways is coming in with an organized toolkit. So we bring in 7 systems, we bring in DIDAR, we bring in a bunch of tools that have already placed some degree of organization around what we're piecing together. The other piece, I think, comes down to that communications aspect, is setting in place some things that simplify a lot of the complexity, particularly in the communications front, right? Thinking about having common vocabulary and adapting that vocabulary to the company or companies in which you've now been parachuted in. Thinking about things like, how do you articulate tasks? Yeah, I've seen time and time again, you walk in, someone says, oh, US comms plan. And that's a task. And that just creates complexity. That creates friction. Starting to get clear around how do we use things like, we use a technique called the 6 T's. What's the target, timing, the tools, the team, the task, and the tactics to get something done. So when you're able to parachute in with a kit bag full of stuff, and you're able to start thinking about the role as driving decisions, not just monitoring progress, you can start to really create an environment that acts as that backstop against the magic. Now, hard work works when nothing else works. So that's got to be in that mix as well. And you're typically going to, when you mobilize, because you're bringing these new tools in, you're going to have to get a lot of people's thumbprints on it. That's where culture becomes super important. You had kind of a nod. Did we duck your question, or did we answer it, Nick?
I'm not sure it's entirely answerable, so I think you both did a good job of giving a go at it. But I suppose the good news is, if you take Pekka's point in terms of, you've got to be burnt before you can learn from this, then I suppose the good news is that 70-80% of deals are going down in flames, as it were. So certainly anybody who's done an acquisition before should have some tangible learnings and therefore a desire to do things better. So even if they don't know what it is, then there should be some skeletons in the cupboard that would point to the fact they do need some new ideas and some new thinking.
I love your point around deal failure. Go ahead, Pekka.
I was going to say, I mean, and to that point, right? I mean, yes, they do fail, and sometimes they fail for a reason, right? Maybe they've not been scoped properly, maybe they've not been thought through properly. But a lot of it, I think, on the capacity piece comes down to clear planning at the start as well. Why are we doing this? How are we going to do it? And what are we actually going to do? And what do we genuinely need, right? I think there's a lot of cultures out there that won't allow you to speak up and say, this is what I actually need to achieve wherever I'm going, or to be able to articulate as a percentage of the deal value, what is that team that is required, right? Because if you're doing a $1 billion deal, for example, a couple hundred K extra resource ain't going to matter at all, right, to get it done. So I think it's that upfront planning as well that's absolutely fundamental to also help safeguard that the deal doesn't fail. Because if the value is articulated and the strategy is articulated up front, it gives it much higher chances of success, which I think is important. So I don't think those battle scars from failure necessarily are a good thing. I think some of those deal failures can be avoided by not taking all of those punts, or perhaps putting more control in place to allow the deals to succeed.
Yeah. When we're talking about capacity, did you also talk about capability? Because I think I know there's lots of research in terms of companies with greater investment in integration, playbooks, more structure tend to get more value. What a complete surprise. But I think that I haven't seen research beyond the fact that serial acquirers do things better, that actually having practical and having lived experience of M&A is a huge differentiator in this. So, because just think of some of the deals which I've been involved in, then capacity has been an issue. These are busy business leaders who haven't had the time. But also, there's definitely been some questions around capability in terms of often it's their first acquisition and they're not sure how to, let's say, build a relationship with an entirely new sort of commercial team and go about the process of finding and delivering synergies.
The thing you raised, I love you brought playbooks to the forefront, right? Because playbooks have one of two curses. They're either a document that was produced and is so bland that it can't be applied, right? It's almost a platitude towards we will do these things, or they are so detailed that they become rigorous and really just create almost a checklist-like mentality. What you need is that Goldilocks-like just right. Like, how do you get your playbooks to sit in a spot where you're actually empowering those executives to make considerations and to be able to then document and articulate those considerations? So that's one piece on the playbook. I think that's an important tool that's often lacking, and part of the tooling that we would bring in. Right? If you're missing a playbook, we could drop a playbook right in and start building and adapting it for your specific needs. But the malleability of that playbook, right, either being at the two ends, is where I mostly experience those when folks write it. In both of those two ends, most people have those sitting on the shelf and aren't using those for their day-to-day use. And that just totally eliminates the need that someone's done some structured thinking about what we need to do. The second piece I think is important, and part of the magic is just the mindset of embracing risk. I think a lot of folks try to avoid risk, and you mentioned most deals do fail for a whole bunch of reasons. So not having a mindset, particularly from a new sponsor perspective, of viewing risk as a bad thing and trying to not necessarily embrace it, but trying to avoid conversations about risk. And, just themes of, I don't want to have a lot of things on my RAID log that I've heard sponsors say in the past, or, I don't want to see red on next month's documents. It strips that sponsor, particularly if they're a new sponsor, of a tremendous amount of decision value that sits in the red, because they need to be making a decision. Do I put more resources to that? Do I remove resources from that? Do I change the target? If I change the target, how do I achieve benefit someplace else? So there's a tremendous amount of decision value that gets ignored when you have a new sponsor in there. And that's part of that integration leader's role, is we've got to be coaching and mentoring some of these sponsors at the same time that we're coaching and mentoring some of the founders or the acquired company leadership. Again, that just adds to the complexity of why you need more senior people with the chipped teeth, the blackened eyes, the skinned knees, the gray hair, the pelts, the scars, however you want to describe that. You need those kinds of folks sitting in there and going, yeah, that might seem like a good idea, but have you considered X, Y, and Z?
Yeah, and I think your question, Nick, was around capability, right? So I guess from my perspective, there's a couple of things linked to that as well. So often these things are the first time somebody has done them, especially if the deals are massive, right? Because people haven't encountered them, there aren't as many of them. So I think some of it does come down to that playbook concept, just having some kind of initial way of figuring out, well, what do we actually need to do, and then it's starting to adapt that. A lot of it comes down to having clarity on roles and responsibilities, and actually who is responsible for what, the right work stream structures, the right people involved, and having clarity in terms of who those folks are, and then helping bring externals to guide them in specific aspects. So at Sisua, for example, we bring the program management element, we bring the integration management office element to help drive and standardize and help people figure out what those processes are. But we don't pretend to be tax experts or finance experts or those kind of things. So certain roles, I suppose, or certain support needs to be brought externally. And actually, it's a case of standardizing some of the activity and then helping guide people. And then the other thing I would say is there is an absolutely fundamental piece around communication, making sure that people understand at the start where we're going and repeating that message over and over again on a regular basis, because people forget, they're busy, and often these things are side of desks. So whilst the capability angle may be there in terms of the execution. They may not actually have the understanding of what needs to happen, or may not have the understanding of those interdependencies. And that's where I think strong program management, strong coordination, and strong communication really comes into play. And then that needs to feed into those playbooks after the deal, during the deal, to enhance them with whatever is nuanced for that specific organization. And then I would also say on the playbook concept and relating to the in the chat, the comment about too detailed is they need to be accessible. They can't just be documents that actually sit in a drawer, otherwise they're useless. They need to be things that people can access, that are intuitive and accessible, and can be made larger or smaller depending on the deal size. So I think they do, everything has a place to play. But I do think M&A initiatives are extremely complex, and not everybody knows everything. So it's important to bring the right resources at the right time and really focus on that planning aspect of what actually needs to happen, where is the help needed, and where there isn't, there is a capability gap, an understanding gap, or a process gap, then those need to be ironed out across the team so that everybody can figure them out and clearly communicate what's happening. And that often bridges that gap in my experience.
Startups, or a couple of startups that I work with, they have had a nice mantra for their playbooks, and it's tools, not rules. So it's basically having these things available that are inherently useful to you, as opposed to lots and lots of process and checklists and things like that. So
I'm a big fan of the checklist manifesto, but I'm also the exact opposite when I think about M&A playbooks, right? Because the minute you turn it into a checklist, you create this mindset of, well, I've done step one, I've done step two, now it's step three. And everyone forgets that those steps are more like a golf swing. There's a lot of fluidity between them, and there's a lot of interdependencies that happen between all of those steps. So that, again, seeing the comment in there by Sam, right? Those checklisty ones are terrible. Those really long ones that are almost written by the compliance team. And I'm going to steal your tools and rules, Nick, by the way. So thanks for sharing that one.
That's okay. I still on it myself. So share and share alike.
Okay, so we had another question from Oliver saying, so we are currently in pre-deal negotiations. From your experience, at what point should we begin planning for post-merger integration?
I'll jump in on that one. I've got some thoughts, particularly since I'm predominantly more a pre-deal guy than a post-deal guy. Day one, right? The minute you say, let's do a deal, you have to start thinking about how you're going to mitigate risk in that deal. So I think about risk in the construct of three things. I can avoid the risk, say I'm not doing the deal. But if I choose to do the deal, I have to either address the risk or accept the risk. And the first place that I can address the risk is with deal structure. That's one of four, right? You think deal structure, you think contracts, employment contracts, vendor contracts, those kinds of things. Then you think about insurable risks and then operational risks. Your post-merger plan is your entirety of operational risk management. So if you're not thinking about that from day one, you're already behind. Now, what impediment is to thinking about that on day one? Many deal teams are separate from the integration teams. So there's often this air of exclusivity, right? Oh, this is pre-deal. We don't need to talk to you until then. And that's some of the things that when we're working with our clients, we try and help them overcome, right? Get that integration, right? It's business planning. How are you going to get the value that you have priced into this deal? You've set it. You're going to mobilize the team to go get it. So I think it's a day zero issue, like day zero of the deal life cycle, not day zero of closure.
Yeah, and I would echo that as well. I mean, it's as early is the right answer, because actually redefining business process, cleaning up data, cleaning up whatever needs to happen later is extremely difficult and takes time. And actually, when the deal gets going, people don't understand what it means. So you need to start understanding and mapping out what are the dependencies, what's actually the likely changes, how are we actually going to operate once the deal is done, and what might that world look like, so that there is a ready-made plan to execute from day one. And that includes, how do we actually govern the integration itself once the deal is closed. How do we ensure that we have the right level of resources, whether that's financial resources, whether that's actual humans or systems or tools available from day one? And some of those take time to put in place. And actually, you can't have people ramping up in the business the day that or new people ramping up in the business when the deal closes to try and figure out what's going on. They need to be ramped up earlier so that they're ready to start to execute once the integration happens, or you're behind the curve. It just causes pain. So I think it definitely is an earlier rather than later activity, and it's very comprehensive, but it detracts from all the pre-deal activities and from a lot of the BAU. So there's a balance there, and that comes back to some of the arguments we made in our chat around how do you backfill people and how do you actually bring in support early to make sure that it doesn't bite you later.
Thank you, guys.
Effectively, it's that golf swing. I'll just one closing thought, right? You wouldn't take a golf swing, kind of line up your backswing, make contact with the ball, and then throw the club to somebody else to finish. And I see too much of that pattern often happening because they haven't gotten the integration folks involved earlier. They don't understand how value's been priced into a deal. They don't understand or even have access to, in a lot of cases, the raid logs that someone doing Q of E or the legal diligence have actually pulled together that are going to be issues that they have to address in the operational plan and the integration plan.
Thank you for that. That's coming, Mike. So we have a question from Tony. He says, are organizational changes always required when you embark on an M&A initiative?
It's a great question.
And the simple answer is no. It really depends where you're going and what's going to happen, right? It's you often need an organization to do the transition, which may or may not be the same. So bolstered resources, as we talked about previously, but actually sometimes the outcome is just a standalone organization at the end of it that continues to operate. So I think my view is actually there's not necessarily organizational changes that are needed, but all of that needs to be thought through up front as to what does it mean and where are you going and what's the value that's being driven, and therefore what changes need to be put in place to realize that value.
Yeah, your rationale will define it, right? We've gotten into places and experiences with things like earnouts. You want to avoid making any organizational changes, but at the same time, if your whole premise for buying the company was to gain access to a market and you're going to offshore the capabilities to your offshore centers, you are going to have an organizational change, right? That's just gonna play out. If you're doing any kind of combination of those businesses, you don't need two CFOs, right? So you've priced in, the deal team probably priced in, having one CFO, and then you find out post deal that, hey, that person's actually a good person. We don't want them to go to a competitor. We want to keep them there. And you hear this little pop after you make that thought, and that's a synergy dissipating. So where do you actually capture that synergy back? And that's where I think org changes are going to be an important construct if there's any form of putting these companies together or putting the capabilities together. To Pekka's point, if you're buying as a holdco and you're never seeing any kind of interaction, you may still need to consider some organizational changes, because who are the liaisons that actually coordinate joint selling, cross-selling, or any of the things that you might have contemplated in that strategic plan?
Yeah, if I can sort of just add something to this, I think change is often massively underestimated in this entire process, and what the level of change, certainly in the seller, and the point at which that change starts, and then the amount of control that people think they have later on. So I think from a sort of seller point of view, then it's all organizational change all the way through, because they're constantly assessing their roles and their contributions and how they run their business and how they're going to have to reconfigure. I think for me, the interesting thing is the unanticipated and unexpected organizational changes that the buyer has to go through in order to accommodate and to basically enable, provide the right environment for the seller. So I'm not sure how much buyer diligence do you guys get involved in?
I do quite a bit because I'm a buy side person. So yes, I do.
When I say buy diligence, I mean diligence of the buying organization, not diligence of the
Okay,
selling
yeah.
organization.
You
Just to basically
threw me
try
off
and
there.
work
You
out,
threw me
just to
off.
look inside your own shop before you buy, and then try and work out, yeah, okay, because obviously all these deals are transformations in one way or another, and the transformations are probably not going to be limited just to the seller. They're also going to have some change impact on the buyer as well. So how can we anticipate and spot those in advance, I suppose?
I've got an active buy side right now, Nick, and while I wouldn't have called it buy side diligence, what we've been calling it is buyer readiness. And this whole buy side started with the, hey, we'd like to buy an AI company. We think it would be valuable. And it was like whack-a-mole, right? It was this, hey, you want to be sold, right? Kind of whack-a-mole type approach. Once we got past that first deal and that deal didn't consummate, we realized the buyer wasn't ready to acquire. We started thinking about what are the kinds of things that the buyer needs to have in place to do that. And a lot of those were even just codifying their own sales motions, codifying their own plans, starting to think about how to assess deal rationale, having the tools to do the search and screen so that you're not just marrying the first person you meet. So there was a bunch of that. I would not have, and I like the way you're thinking about it in terms of that is buyer diligence. That is making sure the buyer has the capacity, the capabilities, and in many cases the attitude to appropriately acquire. Right? The Margaret Wegner in a previous place said it best. Hey, I love you. Now change. And I watch time and time again with clients that you have this small company that doesn't even have an IT department. Now they have this massive IT department. That's a fundamental change in how they operate, particularly when it's a true acquisition, not a merger of equals type place. But excellent point, Nick.
Yeah, and I think on the change management side, I mean it's fundamental, right? I think some of the clues come in when actually these organizations talk to each other. Are their values aligned? Are the people actually aligned? I mean, I think quite often you do see um, mergers that happen that start off as a happy marriage, and actually they slowly start to dissipate when people get together, and you start to realize what it all means. So I think all of these programs actually have a massive change management element to them on all sides, because sometimes when organizations are being divested from much larger organizations, there's some pain there as colleagues split up, and all of that happens, and people don't talk to the same folks anymore, which requires change management on all sides to make sure that new ways of working exist. And then in the new organizations or the ones that are being acquired, there's lots of change management there as well and fear. So I think change management in itself as a discipline plays a very large role in these. And just like in major transformations, is actually very underestimated on a regular basis and under budgeted for because it's perceived as, well, we'll just do this thing and it'll work, and the pain will come later. As I said before, you can invest in this up front and make the ride smoother, or you can wait for phase two after the deal and the transaction having completed and the integration having completed to put in place the change management, which is much more costly and much more painful. So I think the human factor should never be um, underestimated in all of this, and actually really should be thought of up front, especially once you start to hit the actual deal day itself, because post-merger integration requires heavy change management. And at that point, if you start planning for change management, it's too late. So I think there's a piece here around start thinking about the change early, pre-deal, just to make sure that you know what to do and how to win minds and influence friends, right, and people to go in the right direction.
Nick, there's
Absolutely.
a mindset aspect to this that I think ameliorates some of the challenge you have of not doing buyer diligence. Often the deal teams are thinking, I'm buying this company, right? I'm making $100 million investment. I'm buying the company. The company is what's going to be absorbed by my parent. Most folks think about that as an asset-based approach, right? I just bought this asset. Let's try and maximize the value out of this asset. I think early intervention with those teams and starting to think about you're actually making $100 million investment in the parent company through an acquisition. And now starting to think about the human and intellectual capital lenses through that lens around things like retention, succession planning, talent development, talent expansion. Those are all things that when you change or shift the focus of that lens back to the parent company, you tend to get a lot of these positive secondary and tertiary effects of, hey, I'm actually changing the entire organization, not just the acquired organization.
Yeah, I think the change management point is a really key one, because everyone will say that's really important, but how much change management is actually going on within the host, within the buyer organization, because often that's where the synergies are, and often that's where the biggest changes need to be, because everyone's very careful about not tearing up the operating model of the selling organization so it doesn't collapse on day one. So there's always a gradual evolution, but to generate any sort of joint value propositions or synergies, then often that means there's got to be genuine behavior change within the buying organization. So I'd love to see those sorts of programs locked and loaded, not too much before the deal, because obviously these things are secret, but just I feel as though that's something I get heavily involved in when I get later on during the integration process, and it's too late then. So you've got this sort of us versus them mentality, and it's like, well, we do things this way, they do things that way, and we need to sort of, what you really want is people knowing on day one that however they operated previously, almost certainly it's going to change, and to help them with that in a sort of structured program, and do that within the buyer side. So
I think in a lot of in the best cases, right, it's relatively open in terms of what those differences in ways of working and processes are. And I've actually seen where it bleeds both ways. So the buying organization enforces its own disciplines or practices on the bought organization, but also the people who've been bought then actually bring best practice to the mothership, and start to influence there and build something. So if done right and the change is managed right, then actually it can have a huge benefit on both organizations. But I think if change management is ignored, then it causes huge problems. And as Kathy, as you say in the chat, it's perceived to be an unnecessary cost to the deal. The reality is some of these deals cannot realize their value without it, and it is a underplayed discipline in all organizations too often. So I think it's important to realize that.
Yeah, I think
It's expensive.
back to, sorry, Mike.
It's expensive, but not doing it is costly. And you make the choice, as Pekka said earlier, right? The pain of investment or the pain of regret.
Yeah. And going back to Nick's point, I think looking at the acquiring organization and making sure the acquiring organization is set up to be changed as well, if you like, that takes bold leadership, because it's really difficult to go out to an organization and say, hey, you need to change the way you're working, and everyone's going, now hang on, we're acquiring a smaller organization or an additional organization to do all this stuff. Why do we need to change? So it requires that vision, that clear communication in order to sustain changes on both sides and deliver the value.
100%. Any other thoughts?
Well, I have one sort of big question, which I don't think was part of your chat, but seeing as you're here, I might as well say anyway, and that is, how much is AI effectively raising the stakes in M&A? Because prior to effectively what's exploded in the past 12 months, then M&A was relatively simple. Buy that company, spot some value, add them onto ours. Whereas now the reality is, in all future deals, both those companies, the buyer and the seller, are going to be moving targets, because they are going to be looking at their AI initiatives. So it feels to me that there's a whole new configuration, or there's a whole new factor that needs to be brought into the equation when you're looking not just at the value plan, but also at the fit and all the operational changes. So how do we handle this? Because the last thing you want to do is buy a company that has got all the right fundamentals and looks great, and then turns out to be the one that actually can't be transformed with AI over the next sort of 2 or 3 years. So it feels like the process of doing diligence and operational planning has actually got a whole lot harder.
I think there's
It's
a
an
whole bunch,
interesting point.
yeah, I mean, I think it's a great point. I think there's a whole bunch of things to unpick in that one, right? I mean, first one is how you do due diligence, and can AI actually enhance that, gathering data, analyzing data, and all those kind of bits. But then I think there's a piece here around um, AI driven change within an organization, right? No one knows where it's going. So if a deal takes 18 months to execute, for example, within 18 months, the organization might be absolutely fundamentally different in terms of how it operates, what it does, how profitable it is, whatever, if you're trying to buy an organization. So I think it raises a lot of questions, not only in existing organizations in terms of how they operate, but in terms of the deal rationale. Why are you actually buying this company? What are you hoping to achieve? And recognizing those timelines that are going to be involved. And the other thing I would say is that for me then brings it into focus. Speed, pace of deal is probably going to have to increase to some degree, right, in order to be able to realize some of those values so that there isn't that tremendous change that's happening on both sides. And the second is control. How do you actually make sure that there are regular sense checks as part of the process to say, does this deal still make sense? Or actually, do we need to stop? And you see it in large transformation programs as well. There is a huge reluctance from executives and others to actually either hit the pause button or the full stop button, right? And the deal or the transformation just keeps going because that's what you promised to do. And actually, I think it takes that bold leadership to pause. So I think AI will have massive implications for all of these facets, in my view, but it remains to be seen. And then on the other hand, the way I would see deal teams being able to use AI in a much better way is building out some of these playbooks, building out some of their processes into AI, as long as it's controlled and governed in the right way, to actually accelerate some of the things that are being done. So it's a brave new world, and I think something that we'll all have to embrace as we move forward.
There's a construct that I used to use: every the same, yet every deal is different. And I think the approach to AI, right? It's got all the complexities. How much of that is client or product facing? How much of that is a internal process with RPA or other tools? But there's been lots of points, and there still are points today when you're thinking about what are the constraints or limitations. So a long time ago, some people were on Exchange, some people were on Lotus Notes. Right? That used to be a nightmare for integrating companies, right? But what happened? We figured out how to integrate those companies. So when you start to think about use some of the paradigms and the experiences that have happened in the past, we can start thinking about, well, what really is AI? In many cases, it's not just this black box that's doing stuff. It's like having another employee, and there's a process around it. You've got to put some process integrity around that process, which leads to some of the other things we were talking about. What are the organizational changes? I remember when I first came into M&A, you used to have an analyst role that would go out and find every number in a book. And then Cap IQ came along. It didn't eliminate the need for analysts. It just changed their role. It allowed them to step up and shed some lower level process work. And that's a lot of the work that we're doing to try and apply an AI first approach, right? The construct that, oh my gosh, there's way too many risks out there, I can't manage those, is now a moot point. AI can help me manage those. AI can help curate, basically collate and even prioritize some of those things because I'm able to intersect data much quicker. But it's going to require those process and those program changes. So just like we're now using Cap IQ, everyone's using it. That's even becoming obsolete now with AI. But each of those steps, there were lessons learned about how do you overcome this. We still see it. Pekka's probably doing a lot of this kind of work, right? You're on Workday, I'm on SAP, right? We just put the two companies together because it makes strategic sense. How do we make sure that we're not running two different systems or that we're running a single system appropriately? AI is the same kind of paradigm. And I think just because it feels new and unique, if we forget about the lessons we learned with those other technologies, we're going to relearn a lot of hard lessons. So I'm not afraid of it, Nick.
Well, I think it's exhilarating, right? But also terrifying because there are just so many different components to it. So one is the impact on the entire value creation chain,
Yep.
in terms of virtually, an entire company's value chain is at risk of commoditization. But equally, if AI is deployed correctly, then it can go the other way, and you can take commoditized aspects, and then those can become real sort of value creators. And there's the whole AI readiness of of them. It just makes me wonder: do corporate buyers need to become a little bit more like PE buyers? Because PE buyers would do exactly what you just described, Mike, in terms of say it makes sense to buy this company. Let's put them together and let's see what we can do. We've got 4 or 5 years to create value, whatever it happens. Whereas obviously corporate buyers have got a very particular business case often in terms of right, they need to hit this organic growth number, and then there's the synergy number on top of that. Whereas the idea
and
of
they're often beating the quarterly drum, right? When they're public corporate buyers, which complicates that as well.
Good stuff. I did meet somebody at a conference a couple of weeks ago who was doing software to use AI within the due diligence phase, and he said he thinks he can condense that from like 6 weeks to 2 days. And normally I go, hooray, that's a really good thing. And just the thought of buying a company after 2 days, the machine says buy it, just is totally not convincing. That left me cold, and I'd make a point of not using it.
And if they did that and then said we're time shifting, it's still going to take us 8 weeks, but we're now going to spend 8 weeks on curated and collated data, a lot broader data set. We could do things like simulations. We could spend more time analyzing where and how we're going to mitigate the risk than just trying to identify where the risks are. And that's, I think, a good use case. And we saw this a long time ago. We set up for a large consulting firm, a shareholder value analytics group. And with process automation, we were able to get the production of those things down to 2 or 3 days. And there were a lot of folks that were saying, this is great, we could sell a lot more of these. And we were trying to push back and go, no, let's shift the work to the higher value work and spend more time on writing better stories than just making this kind of first pass equals final copy stuff that was getting pushed out to client teams. And again, that to Kathy's point earlier, that's going to take bold leadership to not bend in the face of that desire of it's just about velocity and speed, and I could do a deal in 2 days, which also means I could divest in 2 days. Right. So you see a lot of the vibe coding stuff where everyone's thrown out Scrum and Agile because I don't need that anymore. If I just make a bad product, I'll just rewrite it in 2 days. I'll rewrite it over the weekend. So I think there's some bad habits that are lurking out there, Nick, to your point, and it does create the dangers, and it does create a grab the desk moment of like, wow, what did you miss? Speed kills.
You mentioned stories. Very famous children's writer over here called Philip Pullman makes a point of writing in a fountain pen because he says there must be friction between the writer's mind and the page, because it's just too easy just to vomit out words on a word processor and stuff. Some friction is a good thing, and I think there's an element of that within due diligence as well. And as you say, it needs time because you need to get to know these people. You need to see them in different situations. You need to see how they respond. So.
Yeah, absolutely. So I should write on my iPad with my fountain pen? Is that what I should take away from that?
Absolutely. Sounds perfect.
Excellent.
Great. Well, look, thank you everybody for joining. The last thing we wanted to leave you guys with is our contact details. Obviously, I'm Pekka Metsaranta from Sisua Limited, www.sisua.co.uk, SISUA. Please feel free to contact me by my email through our website or through LinkedIn. Mike?
Yep, Mike Princi. You find me at mike@thoughtstorm.com. It's the best place to find me. I love the topics. I love the engagement. I could see some other sessions coming out of this, particularly the AI session. That's probably 7 months worth of content, Nick, that you just dropped on the table.
Thank you everybody for your time, and really appreciate the questions, and thank you very much. Have a fantastic
Excellent.
rest of your day.
Thank
Thanks,
you as well. Have a great rest of week.
Okay.
Just bye.